Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in the listen-only mode. During the question and answer session, please press star 1 on your touch-tone phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I will turn the meeting over to Mr. Jared Liu. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone. This is the Brown Bag Lunch Series, which is a monthly webcast held at the lunch hour. The trainings leverage local successes by amplifying to a larger audience two model organizations, methods, materials, and approaches. Sessions are planned to last no more than an hour with two presenters speaking on the same topic from slightly different perspectives, each for about 10 to 15 minutes, followed by a questions and answer session. It's particularly interesting for us today just to show how national this can be. All the presenters are, speaking from their own locations, but this is the first time that ACT is actually traveling as well. So we're broadcasting from Tree Utah's location in Salt Lake City. So it's just the power of the web. But this is a program of the Alliance for Community Trees, and if you're not a member, I want to encourage you to consider joining. Today's session is Heading Towards Sustainability, Part 1, Agroforestry. Agroforestry is a system that intentionally combines growing trees and shrubs with other crops and or livestock. A well-managed agroforestry system may be just a part of the solution to sustainability. It improves soil and water quality, reaps economic benefits for the producer, and yields a suite of environmental benefits. Once established, agroforestry projects may require less labor compared to agricultural crops of equal economic value. Today's first speaker is Richard Straight. He's originally from Iowa, where he received his BS and MS in forest management. He has served as a city forester in Iowa, a field service forester, a state staff forester for the NRCS, both in Nebraska, and for the last 7 years as the technology transfer lead for the USDA National Agroforestry Center. The center is a three-way partnership of two divisions of the USDA Forest Service, those being research and development and state and private forestry, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. His primary focus at the Agroforestry Center is to promote the understanding and adoption of agroforestry in the U.S. This is done by providing information and training to natural resource professionals who in turn work with private landowners. Working as a forester in the land of corn, beans, and cows, and he has learned lessons on the benefits and power of partnerships. Even his favorite pastime of upland bird hunting is dependent on a partnership with his dog. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jared. Been looking forward to this webcast. Okay, am I still live?
I'm hearing you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I've been looking forward to this webcast. One, it's the first one for me, but also I've met briefly with Brad in the past, and it's good to connect up with him as well in Trees Forever. I'm going to start off with just a brief introduction of the Agroforestry Center and agroforestry, and then we'll get on to how this might relate to some of our community partners. So agroforestry at the edge of the world, and I'm thinking more along the edge of rural and urban interface in that transition zone. And here at the Agroforestry Center, we are located in Lincoln, Nebraska, but we are a national center. And as was mentioned, we are a fairly unique partnership within the United States Department of Agriculture. And for future reference, there are some of my contact information. The basic points that I want to touch on today are a little basics on agroforestry, so we know what we're talking about when we hear the word agroforestry. A little bit on how these technologies can be applied in that urban transition area as well as in urban areas, and then a little bit of perspective on agroforestry as a tool for sustainability. But to begin with, agroforestry, as we mentioned, is really combining trees and crops in its simplest form, and we can get all kinds of folks to debate about definitions, but that'll do for today, and that's the one I like to use. So we talk about agroforestry as the intentional mixing of trees and or shrubs into crop and animal production systems for economic, environmental, and social benefits. So there's very much an intentionality about agroforestry. It's not just a happenstance or just dumping things together. So with agroforestry, we've used a phrase, and many of our publications use the phrase working trees. And we want that to indicate that it's the right trees in the right place for a specific purpose. That is, these are trees that have a job to do. They're not just ornamentation, and we intentionally place those trees for specific jobs. We'll talk a little bit about that. So agroforestry, we break it down into basically 5 basic practices, and if you look at them on the landscape, they kind of run a continuum. We have windbreaks there, which are fairly widely spaced across the landscape to protect crops and soils, and then we have maybe an alley cropping system, which are more closely spaced. We'll define those. And then we actually have riparian forest buffers along our streams and waterways, multi-story cropping, and then finally civil pasture systems, which are primarily used in the southeast and the northwest part of the country. And so I'll briefly describe each of these. And probably in their beginning, the least likely to be utilized for our urban audience is multi-story cropping, sometimes called forest farming. And this is really the manipulation of the forest for the production of non-timber forest products. So these these non-tree, non-timber type products provide many benefits, economic opportunities for the producers, utilizing the entire forest, not just the upper canopy of the trees, and we can also improve the utilization of that forest and its species composition. So such products might include medicinal plants of ginseng and cohosh and jack in the pulpit, handicrafts, unique pieces of wood and vines, decorative florals. Some of those are dogwoods and forsythia and witch hazel that produce a very unique colored stem or a unique forced flower that we might use in floral arrangements, and then many different kinds of food products, not just fruits, but including mushrooms. And so we'll just move on from multi-story cropping today. The next practice, which is a little more applicable, I think Brad will get into this a little bit more, windbreaks. And again, these are usually linear type plantings, and they provide protection from damaging winds. And pretty straightforward, and we can use these windbreaks in many different configurations, and so one size does not fit all. We can talk about modifying the wind speed, which affects the humidity, it affects temperature, it affects wind chill for livestock and for places where we live. We can manage snow, we can drift snow, or we can spread snow out. Depending on the type of configuration, windbreaks are very, very adaptable practice. And this is just one example of maybe a visual screen. Again, you have building, and then demonstrating how we can actually put a visual screen up there to protect the site from unsightly traffic and possibly reduce to a minor extent some of the noise and noise pollution that we experience in our communities. Another practice, riparian forest buffers. Again, these are permanent vegetation that intercept runoff from agricultural lands to protect our waters, whether they're streams or ponds or lakes, from some of the sedimentation and the fertilizer and contaminants that ride along with runoff waters. And this is a very, very common practice with and without trees across the landscape and across the country. The benefits, as we talked about, are really water quality and protecting not just drinking water and swimming recreational water, but water for personal use, for drinking water for communities, wildlife habitat, protecting stream banks, and to some extent even flood protection by reducing the speed of runoff. And these can be used in urban areas as well within urban watersheds. Just a simple example, Topeka, a town of about 120-some thousand, 1 inch of rain is over 1 billion gallons of water over that community. And we can use vegetation to reduce the quantity of runoff and the rate of runoff. We talk about how we manage water in our communities, and commonly we use these hard surface gray infrastructure systems, and what we talk about is using this riparian buffer sort of technology in our urban areas and keeping the green, keeping the sense of place, and again, improving water quality and managing the runoff and the rate of runoff. And it's a more sustainable system, although it takes a little more engineering. Here's another example of how we might use vegetation along these stream banks in these urban areas where we can stabilize those banks that have been eroded from the high speed and high volume runoff. And these animated pictures are done with a software called Canviz. It's just a very straightforward image manipulation software, a much streamed down version of Photoshop. And so again, we can use vegetation, these riparian forest buffer technologies in our urban areas to improve the location's beauty and aesthetics, but also that working aspect of protecting the landscape and water quality. So how do we take this agroforestry and make it sustainable? What are the opportunities that we have? We can look at our existing development situations when they need to be renovated or when they become outdated. It's more efficient if we look at future development and that expanding edge of our communities. And that's where we can be much more efficient use of our dollars and our time in planning ahead. And then the more we look at the watershed perspective and the landscape perspective, the more effective we will be rather than looking at site by site. And that's just a part of sustainability when you look at the approach of managing these resources. And then, of course, the connectivity across the landscape, looking at multiple watersheds for energy flow, for water flow, for wildlife, and for people movement. So briefly, existing developments. This was an example in Topeka, Kansas, where the stormwater pipe could no longer handle the rate and volume of stormwater runoff. And so what they found was the traffic, they didn't need 3 lanes. They took 1 lane, and they made a series of bioswales that take some of that stormwater into this faux stormwater drain that actually allows the water to move into a vegetated area. Obviously, this was during the development phase. And so they found that they didn't have to actually increase the size of the stormwater pipe because some of that stormwater was diverted into these swales where it more slowly percolated into the soil and then drained into that underground pipe. So look for those kind of opportunities. And here's another example of a parking lot that was in need of renovation, so it was an opportunity, as long as they were resurfacing it, to put in a bioswale into a parking area, again, to reduce the rate of runoff and improve the quality of the waters that percolated through the soil, interacted with the soil and the plants, and then it was drained on out through a stormwater drain. And so this is another opportunity of existing conditions. But the future development is the place we want to look, in our expanding edges of our communities. That's where we have the opportunity to coordinate across the landscape with our rural programs, of conservation programs, and our urban dollars being spent to make them complementary rather than isolated programs. And when we start looking at the watershed perspective, we start looking at how these practices and how these land uses and vegetation covers are arranged on the landscape. And we start talking about how the wildlife moves across the landscape, how wildfire moves across the landscape, and how the buffers can reduce conflicts of land use, but also ameliorate some of the problems that we experience with the development as well as agricultural uses of the land. And sometimes this GIS is a very useful tool when we're looking at landscape perspective. We also talk about the approach of using green infrastructure as a strategically planned, managed network of permanent vegetation of working lands across the landscape, so they are interconnected in providing those services for people and for the environment. We're talking about there are different ways that this conservation can make money. One is from payments from ecosystem services for water quality, for wildlife habitat, others willing to pay for wise use of the land of the person who owns the land, or actually making money off of products. And I'm going to move through this fairly quickly here to finish up. So carbon offsets, we're hearing more and more about carbon trading, water quality trading, air quality trading, and even pollination services are types of ecosystem services. And that's something that people may want to look into in more detail on their own. We can also talk about growing some different products in these areas of permanent vegetation. And we've even seen in urban areas that people actually harvest material from public lands for their own personal use. Craft materials, nuts, fruits, vegetables, all these sorts of things can be managed for on these private lands. And when the conservation is making a profit or helping make a profit for the landowner, it's more likely to be maintained on the landscape because it's serving the individual and their site as well as a larger public. So that's just a very, very brief fast overview of agroforestry and how it might work with communities across that rural-urban landscape. And I think we'll just let it go for that right now. And if there are any brief questions, I'll take those, I guess, right now.
Great. Yeah, if the operator can open the lines for questions, please.
Certainly. If you do have a question, please press star 1. Please unmute your phone and record your name clearly when prompted. Your name is required to introduce your question. One moment, please, for the first question.
Great. And participants can either ask a question that way, or there's a question manager box down at the bottom of your screen, and you're welcome to type a question in and have me read it as well. I want to start off by asking Rich about, I guess following up on some of the case examples. Topeka sounded like it was certainly a case example of how they integrated stormwater, and the Hillcrest Community Center seems like another great example. Do you know about, were there any particular challenges in integrating agroforestry into the urban setting? Like, who were the champions? Who were the hurdles? How did they go about that process?
Sure, and first off, I want to say that when we're talking about that urban landscape, like that Hillcrest Community Center parking lot, we really don't refer to that anymore as agroforestry. There just isn't the agricultural component, but it is using some of that technology that's been developed with riparian buffers in an urban setting. So I didn't want people to be think that I'm doing agroforestry in an urban setting like that. But yeah, there are some very interesting things. We find that change almost always requires a champion. And in the case of Topeka, there was a stormwater engineer who really wanted to try and do things differently, better, and more sustainably. It does take sometimes changes in ordinances to allow to do things differently. The engineering community has specific standards that they sign off on for such things as stormwater and surface water runoff. And because there is so much at risk in these urban areas, there's much hazard if a system doesn't work or function properly. It does take a little bit of practice on small sites like one parking lot to help the engineering community feel comfortable and have confidence in these sorts of green infrastructure approaches to stormwater. So those are some of the primary barriers, is finding somebody who is willing to take the extra time to design something better rather than using a familiar, expedient design system for handling stormwater runoff. It helps to have support of a city council or a city council person who can stand up and back the efforts for change. And then and that particular one is trial and error. We created an engineered soil, figured it would be wet a fair amount of the time, used some wetland plants, and lo and behold, because we wanted the water to percolate through the system, it's actually much drier than we expected, and we killed a lot of trees and shrubs, and we had to replant with trees that were a little more drought tolerant. So you do live and learn through these sorts of experiences.
And it sounds from what you're saying that it really, a lot of it relies on a strong public-private partnership, because it sounds like it was the public sector that was making those official steps, but the private sector was really rallying to it.
And correct. And when you start getting neighborhoods backing your changes and saying, yes, we like what you're doing to our neighborhood, then they can speak to their council folks and help support those sorts of changes. So it is an educational effort as well.
Okay. Right at the end, you had touched on some of the other applications of agroforestry, like the fruit and nut. In the beginning, you talked on the noise reduction and some of the other benefits. Can you touch on any other examples, some of the more innovative agroforestry projects that are happening around the country, particularly if they're in urban areas?
Let's see here. We do have some folks trying to utilize in our travel corridors and trying to figure out how to design travel corridors that also parallel water courses, waterways, so that we have a more efficient use of the landscape, and then using the riparian buffer or riparian forest buffer technology to buffer the impact of the hard surface roads and the neighboring streams. So it actually you start looking at the layout on the landscape of traffic, pedestrian trails, as well as the water courses, or where we're trying to have water drain. And again, we want to reduce the rate of flow so we don't have too much energy in that water so that it cuts the bank and causes extra sedimentation that may flow into a stream or even to a drinking water reservoir. So those are some creative ways of actually, in new housing developments, is looking more creatively at how roads, water courses, and the movement of people can be more efficient, and then using the vegetation to buffer the impact. And we're also seeing that when we're using the trees and shrubs and green space in communities, it does create a sense of space for people that they call home, that they're familiar with, they want to stand up for and help take care of, and will speak out vocally to the community, the city councils, that they want to see these places maintained because they are a part of what they call home, and rather than just hardscape gravel parking lots and wide open grass fields are good for ball fields, but they don't quite have the same impact and don't develop the same sense of loyalty that well-treed and vegetated areas create in people's minds. Those are just a couple of ideas that I've seen implemented, as well as stormwater detention and retention systems.
I'm glad you mentioned the transportation sector too, because on the federal scene, so much of what I see for the climate change discussion is masked within how can we change the transportation sector, whether it's making more efficient cars, which has nothing to do with urban forestry, but there are, I think the unique challenge for us as we move into the climate change discussion is how can we integrate what we do into the transportation sector, because, most of the research that I've seen is saying that the big reductions that we need to make are going to have to come from the transportation sector.
And reduction, not efficiencies, yeah.
Right.
One other thing I have seen a couple of times used are windbreaks for communities. And in smaller communities, particularly in some of the Great Plains states, actually using a windbreak to protect the north and west side of the community in the winter, to drift the snow, to keep the roads from drifting shut. And when you can maintain access for emergency vehicles, for either fire or ambulances, those are some trees that really pay off big values for people. And I've even seen housing developments where people have planted the trees around the individual acreage lots several years in advance of actually selling any of the lots. It has brought a higher price for the lots, as well as helped to speed up the rate of sale of those lots. So windbreaks have a very adaptable and flexible use across the landscape for communities.
Okay. We have a question online. The second point of economic products, habitat interface, is an interesting one. It reminds me of the forest garden concept. Are there examples of forest gardens at the rural-urban interface?
I've only heard of a couple. The forest garden is an interesting concept that's, from what I understand, largely come out of the tropics. And I have heard of smaller communities again. It seems to be easier to garner the support in smaller communities because they all face the same issues. But where a windbreak, again, was planted on the edge of an exposed area of maybe ball fields or on the edge of town where the harsh winds come out of the winter in the north, and they created some space on the downwind side of the windbreak that was used as public gardens. So you have a windbreak that's creating a microclimate, which is reduced winds, higher humidity, less damage to basically the garden crops you grow in your backyard garden of squash and pumpkins and green beans and that sort of thing, and actually had then garden plots for people to grow some of their own home produce. So I have heard of those sorts of practices being used, but only a few examples. I've also, we've talked about a little bit here at the Agroforestry Center of using these tree plantings as buffers to reduce conflict from land uses, because we have so many, even in small towns in rural Nebraska and rural Iowa, I've seen conflict of people moving out of town into maybe a 5-acre or 10-acre lot, and they are more community, city-type people, and that's the way their mindset is, but yet they're surrounded by agricultural land. And there can be tensions from those two communities as they merge together. And we've seen where windbreaks and tree plantings can reduce some of those conflicts of land use by reducing the blowing of dust and say corn leaves and things across onto a lawn that is surrounded by cornfields. So we have seen some of those practices used to, again, to reduce social conflict. But as far as the public garden, I've only heard of a few examples, and it strikes me that it is one that could be used more and more to provide more functional and protected land use for the public. I'd be interested in hearing of any examples that people have seen myself.
Okay. What resources are available to anyone who's thinking about agroforestry, whether through the National Agroforestry Center or other federal partners or state and local partners or funders? What's out there that you're aware of that people can tap into?
Well, again, if you mentioned, we have a fair amount of educational material on our website, and that's on the front slide of the second slide of this presentation. If you want to take a look at it. And we have some information on working trees for communities, and we have, you're changing it up there, thank you. You can find a number of publications, everything's, we can have hard copies sent to you for free. You can order them off that webpage, as well as download a PDF version if you're interested. The University of Missouri has a Center for Agroforestry, another good place for finding agroforestry information and some technology information. Some training videotapes are available as well. And then you'll find several universities around the country are picking up on some agroforestry practices. I believe Tennessee State, University of Alabama, A&M, and Florida A&M. Some of the 1890 universities are picking up on agroforestry for use with landowners. The Southern University in Louisiana is another one that has a very good urban community forestry program and is promoting the use of trees and maybe not your typical street tree format, more of agroforestry technologies adapted to community use. So those are some of the key sources I would go to for information. And I think one of the big challenges is for our communities to work with our rural conservation districts and the resource conservation and development districts so that we can coordinate the conservation practices that we do across the rural-urban continuum so that we have practices that complement and work together rather than having separate and individual goals, but they're designed to function together. And that's going to take a lot of communication and partnership building. And I haven't seen too many good examples of that. We're trying to work with the Mid-America Regional Council out of Kansas City metro area to do things along those lines. The community of Lenexa, Kansas is a good example of trying to rain. They have a program, I lost the name of it. They have a very good program of looking and utilizing stormwater as a asset, not as a problem to overcome. So Lenexa, Kansas is a good place to look at some of their programs and materials.
Awesome, thanks. Any questions from the operator?
I do not show any questions at this time.
Okay, well, if anyone has any other questions, you can hang on to them. We will open the lines after the second presenter for questions for either. So thanks, Rich. Next up is Brad Riphagen. He is the field coordinator with Trees Forever, where he has been for nearly 13 years. The programs he's responsible for include Neighborhoods in Des Moines, Agroforestry for Organic Producers, and Visioning with Small Communities. In all these programs, he works closely with volunteers to help them develop and implement successful projects. Brad has a BA in biology from Central College in Pella, Iowa, and an MS in land resources from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His thesis examined prairie's impact on soil structure and involved several restorations. He and his family live in Jefferson, Iowa, and his favorite color is Packer green, I understand.
Wrong.
All yours.
Oh, man, heck of a way to start out. Thanks a lot. My favorite color, by the way, for those of you listening, is Viking purple. So Thanks a lot, Jared. But thank you. I appreciate being on today, and I do want to talk a bit about some of the agroforestry practices we've been involved with through Trees Forever, primarily in Iowa, and really want to focus on some community windbreak work that's been happening very recently to a community that we're closely involved with here in Iowa. So I'll start with that. Agroforestry practices, windbreaks, and buffers. And I have to go show you our mission. Basically, we do a lot of work planting and caring for trees and working with people in their communities and promoting the stewardship of those practices that we work with. And these are some of our major program areas. Today, like we're be talking about agroforestry and improving water quality is kind of how we got involved with some of the agroforestry practices through water quality practices, and I'll touch on that again too. Caring for community forests is where we started as an organization working with small communities and large communities in the state of Iowa, helping them build their community forests. Then restoring and beautifying roadsides and working in all of these programs we work with diverse audiences. And I guess there's some slides showing some of the activities. Again, as you see in the slides, we're always trying to involve people as much as possible. Just kind of a sideline here. Trees Forever, we talk about trees a lot, but living in Iowa and working in Iowa, we realize there are other plants that need to be involved in the systems that we work with, and so we do a lot of work with prairies as well in the state, generally focusing on natives as much as possible in all of our plantings. In the water quality and agroforestry work, basically we've been doing some, I guess you could say, agroforestry practices for roughly 12 years, 10, 12 years I guess now, but primarily in the form of riparian buffers and more in relation to functional work of those riparian buffers than that they would be removing sediment and nutrients from the water prior to entering a stream. And so initially we've been working a lot with riparian buffers on that level. We've recently started working with landowners and encouraging them to include in their buffer plantings other species that could help them gain a profit from some of those plantings. So some nut trees, shrubs that may produce a nut like a hazel, or a shrub that could produce a stem that could be used in the woody floral trade. We have done very little, but we have one project doing some alley cropping, and a couple that are installing some silvopasture in their practices. These are all fairly young, and so I don't have any good slides of those. And we've also worked quite a lot with windbreaks in rural and urban areas. And this, just to show you I think Rich had this slide as well. This is Bear Creek. This is our model that we've worked from in terms of the functional buffers that we've installed in the rural landscape in Iowa. This is something that some of the practices, as Rich indicated earlier, that we've learned working with the rural landscape, we've tried to incorporate into some of our work in small communities and the urban landscape. What I'm going to talk about primarily for the rest of the time here is the small town of Fruitland, which is in eastern Iowa, just south of Muscatine, if you're familiar with Iowa. It's probably south and west a bit of the Quad Cities, maybe half hour or so. And this area of the state grows a lot of, it's Iowa, you think corn and beans, but it grows a lot of melons. Muscatine melons, which is kind of a regional name. Several people know about it as kind of like a cantaloupe, and watermelons and some other fruit crops. And so I'm going to go through a case study on what's been happening at Fruitland. Just to give you a little more background on them, this is a small community, obviously, 703 people. It's in the Mississippi River floodplain. Soils are quite sandy in the area. It's an outwash area. And they had several thousand windbreak trees planted back in the 30s by the CCC. And this, I'm going back to another photo again here. This is an aerial of a portion of the town. And you can see running north and south on a lot of these streets and also along the railroad tracks here, and then throughout the community, even over way on the far right side, you see another row of cedars. These are paired rows of cedars that were established early on in the community. And we'll talk about a little bit the impact of those trees that they've had on the community. And this is what happened to Fruitland a year ago. This coming June, they had a tornado go through, and very devastating. Took out many trees, and just a major mess. Lots of damage, as you can see on this slide. 29 homes totally destroyed, and there's only 129 in the whole community, 68 damaged. And as I said, nearly 3,000 trees were destroyed. So one of the things that we found right away, and I realize this is a long and wordy slide, but I do really want to read it because the quote is really speaks to the point of the value of some of these practices. And here you have, right after the tornado, you noticed a change in the wind currents. We never knew how hard the wind blew. Sometimes when we were out in our yards, it's like it was a dust bowl. With all the trees gone, the air around our home is so much hotter. We've got the reflection of the sun off the sand. And this is Shelley Amos. She's become a spearhead for the trees in this community now. But her trees basically were her protection and her privacy, and up to her house, neighbors couldn't see her as well. She could hide out in her yard basically. The wildlife loved it. So now they're working strenuously to replant these windbreaks that they found out were so valuable to them and had taken for granted. So as Trees Forever goes, we always try to work in partnership with as many folks as possible. And so one of the things that was organized was a meeting of extension folks from forestry, DNR forestry, local citizens, some of the service groups and so forth at Trees Forever, to do an assessment and really help the community try to organize their efforts around the replanting effort of these windbreaks that were so valuable to the community. And they were able to garner funding from a number of sources. Basically from these 4 sources we have here shown on the slide: Trees Forever, Roy J. Carver, Greater Muscatine Community Foundation, Monsanto. There's approximately $21,000 that they were able to procure for this year's planting efforts. And they're estimating that it's going to cost roughly $75,000 to replace all of what they lost in terms of tree resources. And it's looking like a 3-year effort at this point. They got an early start, really wanted to kick it off, and this is an interesting way to go about it. They lost a number of red cedars. This is a mitigation site that the red cedars were not appreciated on, and so the scouts went and dug red cedars and replanted them in the community. I'm interested to see how well they do, but it's an interesting way to go about replanting some of the plants that were lost. So, moving the slide here. It's going slowly. Jared, am I not moving? Can't get my slide to move.
You want to be on the summary slide? That's what you want?
I'm moving to the next one that I can't get to. Oh, could I go back a couple there? I'm sorry. I'll try.
Here, I'll put you on replanting.
There you go. Thank you very much. Basically, this year, actually this past Saturday, they had planned to plant 825 additional trees, and you see they've at least diversified a little bit. One thing that we really promote through our programs is that they don't plant single species. We are now looking at least 3 species that they're planting in their windbreaks. Iowa tends to be fairly tough on evergreens anyhow, so we don't have a lot of selection, and these are 3 good ones for this situation. And they planted a bit over 400, I guess, this past Saturday, and plan to continue their planting efforts into the fall because they couldn't get them all done. So they're well on their way. They're doing a really good job. And basically these plantings will continue for the next few years. Some of the other things that we're doing with communities, just to kind of touch on them a little bit, we're working with some communities, actually Johnston in particular, which is near Des Moines, on some stream bank stabilization and buffer plantings along that stream that runs through the community. And we do a lot of work with rural landowners on agroforestry practices, although we haven't been able to incorporate some of those practices that would bring additional dollars into the communities, their efforts. So basically that's where we're at. We continue to work with a variety of organizations and populations in the state on agroforestry practices. We are learning. That's why it's wonderful to have National Agroforestry Center in Lincoln and also the folks down in Missouri. Great resources for us to draw upon. With that, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Brad. And if the operator can open the line for questions and answers.
Certainly. If you do have a question, please press star 1.
And again, you can ask audio or you can type a question into the question manager. And I want to start off by going back into the economic viability aspect. You had touched a little bit on the nuts and the alley cropping.
Mm-hmm.
And can you give any examples of projects where you know that there's some sort of supplemental income aspect and what the economic viability of those projects looks like?
I think maybe Rich could do some of that a little better than I. We started implementing some agroforestry practices probably 3 years ago was our first one, and those plantings are quite young. We do have some anecdotal information from some chestnut growers that have done some work, incorporated some silvopasture in with their chestnuts, and are doing, getting roughly $4 a pound for their nuts, and getting roughly 1,000 pounds per acre on older trees. But that's anecdotal. We have none of our plantings that are old enough to really actually get the quantification of the dollars yet. So if Rich has anything to input on that, I'd be welcome that. So.
The University of Missouri, their Center for Agroforestry has been probably the biggest proponent and researcher of alley cropping type systems, and the ones that I have seen actually established and are up and running are primarily revolve around some of the nut trees. Brad mentioned chestnut,
mm-hmm.
as well as black walnut and pecan. And typically what I've seen are one or double rows of the nut trees planted, and then maybe 40 to 60 feet away is another single or double row of nut trees. And in that alley is planted an annual crop. It could be a hay crop, a high-quality hay crop that is being protected by those trees. And I've also seen soybeans and even irises in one situation where they actually grew irises for bulb production and used the trees to protect those sites. I think the reason that the nut trees have been utilized are that within few years, short term for trees that is, 5-7 years, you start seeing some nut production, which also can create income off the trees. But what they're actually looking for is down the road some high value wood production off those trees. So you have an annual income off your row crop, you have an annual income off your nuts that allow you the cash flow to sustain the operation until you can get the high value wood production that may not come for a generation. And so we've seen those systems implemented. And in fact, in Nebraska now, there is a new nut cooperative that has been formed, and they're using primarily nut orchards, but some hay crop in between the nut trees, and they're producing very high quality, locally grown nuts at this stage, primarily black walnut, but they're also looking at hazelnut production. So interesting opportunities there, and that can be done on relatively small acreage.
It's like our own example of the giving tree.
There you go.
What about the lag time between investment and return? How long is that?
From my standpoint, it would depend on the crop that you're putting in. Some of the folks planting shrubs for the woody floral industry can the return, I would say, after 3 to 4 years. And I guess, Rich, you're saying nuts maybe 4 or 5?
At least 5 years, I think, before you start getting anything that you can start promoting and selling, and that's that's at a small scale.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there other particular challenges on economic level, or I guess particular to crop production?
One of the challenges I see is neighbor acceptance, but that's typical for a lot of the folks that we work with. They tend to be early adopters, and neighbors look at them a little strangely, but they tend to deal with that quite well. Kind of jumped away from the question there. Sorry, Jared.
Yeah. I think that's definitely a challenge.
It definitely is. As well, I think when we start seeing the integration of woody perennials into annual crops or into agricultural arena, herbicide drift is always an issue. And there's just no two ways around it. You have to be a bit more cautious and also more attentive to the conditions in which you and your neighbors apply different pesticides. And I think that is a complication that can't be ignored and cannot be just looked over. The management is much more intensive, and yet the revenue and the benefits for the producer as well as the larger community, I think many folks agree, bear that additional labor, and the labor is then returned with income to the producer. So that's another, the pesticide issue, I think, is another one that's worth mentioning as a barrier.
Do you all have any solutions, any magic formulas for dealing with neighbors?
I think communication is, like most of life, I think communication is really a key thing, as letting the neighbors know what you are up to. I know some folks who are growing ginseng and other herbal plants in the understory of riparian buffers and in woodlands, and when they communicate to their neighbors that that's what they are doing, their neighbors act as also kind of a policing of the area when strangers show up, because it's hard to monitor a site like that day in and day out on your own, particularly in a crop like ginseng that may take at least 7 years between seed distribution in the forest floor and having a crop to yield. And so what we found is being very communicative with the neighbors, letting them know what you're up to, so they realize that you're not a threat, that you're also trying to be part of a strong, economic, viable community that's concerned about more than just what's happening on your site.
And I'd like to second that too. And one of the things that we really focus on doing with demonstrations that we are able to work with landowners to plant on their sites is to encourage the neighbors to see what's going on, and also to have organized field events at these sites, so that even the folks that live in the nearby town or in the next county can see what else is going on around them and see what the options are to them. So.
Okay. Georgia asks, can you talk about the role of replanting and recreating a sense of place after storm damage and healing any trauma from experiencing the storm?
That's a wonderful question. I can only speak from my personal experience. I don't know that I've really experienced I haven't experienced a destruction like the tornado that they had in Fruitland. I just find working with volunteers on numerous plantings every year in the area of the state that I work in, that the simple act of being able to put a new living thing in the ground, a tree, seems to make people smile, tends to bring them together. And I think the fact that they're working as a community to reestablish something that they lost as a community, I think is going to be very valuable for the healing in that Fruitland itself. So.
Okay. And does the operator have any questions?
We do not have any questions on the phone.
Okay.
One other point that I would like to bring out, and I think a couple of slides that Brad had make a very good point of this, and it's one point that we talk about when trying to get the cooperation between, say, a community, a city, and what they are doing for, say, stormwater management with vegetation and utilizing green infrastructure ideas and rural conservation programs is, and I think those pictures that Brad had of Fruitland where you could see within what is now a developed community what used to be old windbreaks. And that's one of the concepts that I think, or one of the benefits that we can utilize, is when we can work the communities to help the rural conservation programs promote the establishment of riparian buffers with trees and windbreaks, so that that is a functional, viable, and very vibrant landscape as the community moves into that area. If those trees, those permanent vegetation, are established in areas that will work for development, as we talk about roadways along water courses, they don't have to remove those trees and plant new ones. They can maintain the functional parts of that landscape as it gets developed, and we see that people again value already having trees in place and in a place in the landscape that help ameliorate some of the impacts that development create on the landscape. And I think a couple of pictures that he had there at Fruitland, just perfect examples. Although it wasn't done maybe with that in mind, they are good examples of that sort of benefit of planning ahead and working across the rural-urban boundaries.
Great. And just one last question. Do either of you know of any alley cropping projects taking place in the Northeast?
You're talking not the northeast part of Iowa, right?
Are you talking northeast?
I think they mean northeast of the country. This person's in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, there you go. I do know of one in northeast Iowa, but I don't think that's going to quite go
I don't off the top of my head. I wouldn't be surprised that there wouldn't be something in Ohio that's hardly northeast. But if an alley cropping, I can't claim something off the top of my head, but I bet if I went looking around some of our networks with RC&Ds and NRCS field offices, we might find something. But I can't tell you of a good example right now.
Okay. If you find that, you can send it to me, and I'll include it in the resource list we publish afterwards.
All right.
And I take copious notes on this call, too, because afterwards we'll have the recorded session available along with your PowerPoints and a resource list, just because there are lots of success stories out there, and we can obviously only highlight a couple on these calls, so we try to give an extended learning avenue that way. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up with that. I've posted a link on the screen about a survey. If everyone can go there, you can either click on the link there on the screen, or in the question box there's a survey you can copy and paste. It's a quick survey, 4 or 5 questions, and that'll help us to better program these. Our next webcast is Tree Sales and Giveaways on May 15th. Otherwise, I want to thank our presenters, Brad and Rich. This has been incredibly informative, and like I said, this will be available for download afterwards, and I think it'll be continued learning avenue for people that way. Also want to thank the participants who are on the line, as well as our sponsors, the Home Depot Foundation and the USDA Forest Service. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.